Sparta, the Making of Warriors. Chapter 1, Introduction. Picture 300 men standing shoulder to shoulder in a narrow mountain pass. In front of them, the largest army the ancient world had ever assembled. Behind them, nothing but a cliff and the sea. They know they're going to die, and they stand anyway. That image, the last stand, the red cloaks, the unbroken line, has echoed down 25 centuries. It's inspired movies, video games, gym mottos, and more tattoos than any historian could count. But here's the question we're going to spend the next hour trying to answer. How much of what we think we know about Sparta is actually true? Because the real Sparta was stranger, crueler, and in some ways far more fascinating than the legend. This wasn't just a city full of tough guys with good abs. It was a radical social experiment. A society that took 7-year-old boys from their mothers and turned them into instruments of the state. A society where women had more freedom and more power than almost anywhere else in the Greek world. And a society built, quite literally, on the backs of an enslaved population that outnumbered its citizens many times over. We're going to walk through all of it. Where Sparta came from, and the myth the Spartans told about their own founding. How their strange, split government actually worked. What ordinary daily life looked like, the food, the homes, the customs, the agoge, that brutal education system that turned children into soldiers, the lives of Spartan women, which were unlike anything else in the ancient Mediterranean, the helots, the enslaved majority whose labor made all of this possible and whose suffering is too often left out of the story, the war machine itself, the shields, the spears, the phalanx that terrified Greece for 2 centuries, and finally, why it all fell apart. Because for all their military might, the Spartans couldn't outrun a simple, brutal math problem. They were running out of Spartans. By the end, you'll understand why Sparta still grips our imagination 2,500 years later, and why the truth, once you dig into it, is even stranger than the myth. Let's go back to the beginning. Chapter 2. The Founding of Sparta. Somewhere around the 12th century BCE, the palace civilizations of Bronze Age Greece collapsed. We still don't fully understand why. It might have been invasion, climate change, internal revolt, a breakdown of trade networks, or some combination of all of it. Historians just call it the Late Bronze Age collapse, and it plunged Greece into a few centuries so poorly documented that we call them the Greek Dark Ages. Out of that darkness came a new wave of Greek-speaking peoples migrating and settling across the peninsula, among them a group called the Dorians. According to later Greek legend, the Dorians arrived in the Peloponnese as the sons of Heracles returning to reclaim their birthright, a myth historians now call the return of the Heraclidae. It's a story, not necessarily a historical event, but it tells us something important. The Spartans wanted to trace their bloodline all the way back to the greatest hero in Greek mythology. Whatever actually happened, by around the 10th or 9th century BCE, Dorian-speaking peoples had settled in the region of Laconia in the southeastern Peloponnese, a fertile valley cut through by the Eurotas River, hemmed in on both sides by mountains, Taygetos to the west, Parnan to the east. It's a naturally defensible pocket of land, and that geography would shape everything about what came next. Sparta itself wasn't founded as a single city in the way we usually imagine. It grew out of the merger of 4 and later 5 small villages along the Eurotas. Sparta was, technically, a cluster of villages that never even bothered to build walls for most of its history. The Spartans like to say their walls were made of men, not stone. It's a great line. It's also, as we'll see, a little bit of propaganda, the kind the Spartans were remarkably good at producing. As Sparta grew, it needed more land to feed its population, and it found that land right next door, in Messenia, the region just across the Taygetos Mountains to the west. Sometime in the 8th century BCE, Sparta invaded and conquered Messenia in what's known as the First Messenian War. The Messenians didn't just lose territory. Many of them were reduced to a form of state-owned servitude, becoming what the Spartans called helots. We'll spend a full chapter later on exactly what that meant, because it's central to understanding everything else about Spartan society. For now, just remember this. Sparta's entire economic foundation was built on conquering its neighbors and forcing them to farm the land for Spartan citizens. But conquest brought a problem. The Messenians didn't accept their new status quietly. Sometime in the 7th century BCE, they rose up in a massive rebellion, the Second Messenian War. And for a while, it looked like Sparta might actually lose everything it had gained. Ancient sources describe the war dragging on for years, Sparta fighting for its very survival against the people it had enslaved. And this is the moment, according to Spartan tradition, when everything changed. Facing a population of helots that vastly outnumbered them and terrified of losing everything, the Spartans decided they needed a fundamentally different kind of society. One where every citizen from childhood was molded into a soldier, ready at any moment to suppress a revolt or repel an invasion. Legend credits this transformation to a single lawgiver, Lycurgus. Here's the catch, and it's a big one. Historians aren't even sure Lycurgus actually existed. Even ancient writers like Plutarch, writing centuries later, admitted they couldn't pin down when he lived or confirm the details of his life. He might be a real historical reformer whose story got mythologized over time. He might be an entirely legendary figure invented later to give Sparta's unique customs an authoritative origin story. The same way many cultures invent a single wise founder to explain why things are the way they are. What we can say is this: sometime between the 8th and 6th centuries BCE, Sparta transformed itself. It abandoned the artistic and commercial path that other Greek cities like Corinth and Athens were following, and instead built a society almost entirely oriented around military readiness. This set of customs, laws, and institutions became known as the Lycurgan system, whether or not a man named Lycurgus ever actually wrote it down. By the 6th century BCE, this transformation was complete. Sparta had become something genuinely unusual in the Greek world, not a city of merchants and philosophers, but a city of soldiers, governed by an equally unusual system of power. And that's exactly where we're headed next. Chapter 3. The Spartan Government. Here's something that surprises a lot of people. Sparta wasn't a dictatorship, and it wasn't quite a democracy either. It was something stranger. A system so carefully balanced between competing centers of power that some ancient writers, including Aristotle, considered it one of the most stable constitutions in the Greek world. Sparta had kings, but the kings didn't hold absolute power. It had elders, but they had to work with everyone else. It even had a form of popular assembly. Let's break down how each piece worked. The two kings. Sparta is one of the only societies in history to run on a dual kingship. Two royal families, the Argeads and the Eurypontids, each supplied a king at the same time, and both kings ruled simultaneously for life, passing the crown down through their own bloodline. Why two kings instead of one? The honest answer is, we don't fully know. It may have started as a compromise between two rival clans, or a merger of two of Sparta's founding villages. But whatever the origin, the effect was clear. It prevented any single king from consolidating total power, because there was always a second king watching and often competing with him. The king's primary role was military command. In Sparta's earlier history, both kings would sometimes march out together at the head of the army, until Sparta learned the hard way that two kings on one battlefield tend to disagree at the worst possible moments. After that, the rule changed. Only one king would lead an army out to war at a time, while the other stayed home. Kings also held religious duties, acting as chief priests of the state, and they had a seat, a permanent hereditary seat, on the Council of Elders. But make no mistake, a Spartan king was not an absolute ruler. He could be put on trial. He could be fined. In extreme cases, he could even be exiled or executed by his fellow Spartans. Kingship in Sparta was powerful, but it was also remarkably accountable. The Gerousia above, or perhaps beside, the kings sat the Gerousia, the Council of Elders. It consisted of 28 men, all over the age of 60, plus the two kings, for a total of 30. And here's the catch. You couldn't buy your way onto this council, and you couldn't inherit a seat. It was elected, for life, by the Spartan Citizen Assembly, based on reputation, achievement, and standing in the community. Once you were in until you died. The Gerousia's power was enormous. It prepared proposals before they went to the citizen assembly, and, this is important, it could functionally veto or dismiss decisions the assembly made if the elders judged them unwise. It also served as a criminal court, with the authority to try capital cases, including cases against the kings themselves. In many ways, the Gerousia was the true center of gravity in Spartan government, a body of battle-tested, respected elders acting as a brake on both royal power and popular impulse. The ephors. Then there were the ephors, 5 men elected annually by the citizen assembly, and arguably the most powerful check on the kings of all. The word ephor roughly means overseer, and that's exactly what they were. Every month, the kings had to swear an oath to the ephors that they would rule according to Spartan law, and the ephors in turn swore that as long as the kings kept that oath, they would support the throne. The ephors had staggering authority for a body that only existed for 1 year at a time. They could summon the kings before them, they could fine them, they could even bring capital charges against a king and put him on trial. They oversaw foreign policy, controlled the secret police that monitored the Helot population, which we'll get to later, and had a hand in nearly every major decision the state made. 2 ephors even accompanied the king on military campaigns, essentially acting as political minders watching over the army's commander. Think about that for a second. A king, a man from a royal bloodline stretching back, supposedly, to the age of heroes, could be hauled in front of 5 ordinary citizens, elected for just 1 year, and be forced to answer for his conduct. It's one of the clearest checks on monarchical power in the ancient world, and it's part of why Sparta's system fascinated later political thinkers, including the founders of governments thousands of years afterward. The assembly. And finally, there was the appella, the assembly of all full Spartan citizens over the age of 30. This is the closest thing Sparta had to democracy. All male citizens could attend, and they voted on major decisions, declarations of war, treaties, the election of ephors and members of the Gerousia. But don't picture Athenian-style democracy with citizens standing up to debate freely in front of the crowd. In Sparta, ordinary members of the assembly typically weren't permitted to speak or propose amendments. They simply voted yes or no on proposals brought to them by the Gerousia, usually by shouting with the loudest side winning. It was participation without much genuine deliberation, a citizenry that had a voice, but a fairly constrained one. So what you end up with is a genuinely unique system. 2 kings checking each other, a council of elders checking the kings, 5 annually elected overseers checking everyone, and a citizen assembly providing a layer of popular legitimacy underneath it all. No single person or group could seize total control. It was, in its own way, a masterpiece of institutional paranoia, a government built by people who fundamentally didn't trust concentrated power, even their own. And that same instinct, discipline, structure, mutual surveillance, didn't stop at the palace doors. It ran through every layer of daily life in Sparta, which is exactly where we're going next. Chapter 4. Daily Life in Sparta. If you walked through Sparta on an ordinary day in the 5th century BCE, you might actually be a little underwhelmed. This wasn't a city of grand temples and marble colonnades like Athens. There was no great acropolis crowded with monuments, no bustling agora full of philosophers arguing in the shade. A Spartan visitor from Athens once reportedly joked that if Sparta were ever abandoned and only its foundations remained, future generations would never believe it had been such a powerful city. And he had a point, because Sparta didn't invest its wealth in buildings, it invested everything in people. Homes. Spartan homes were plain, even by ancient Greek standards. Spartan law actively discouraged luxury. Ceilings were required to be made with nothing fancier than an axe, doors with nothing fancier than a saw. The idea was to prevent citizens from pouring resources into private comfort instead of public service. Furniture was minimal, decoration was minimal. Even wealthy Spartans lived in houses that would have looked modest next to the homes of ordinary merchants in other Greek cities. Food. Here's something that broke completely with the rest of the Greek world. Spartan men, from about the age of 20 until they died, ate almost every meal not at home with their families, but in a communal dining hall called a syssicion, a mess, essentially, made up of about 15 men. Each member was required to contribute a fixed quota of barley, wine, cheese, and figs every month, plus money for meat. If you couldn't contribute, you could lose your citizenship rights entirely. And the food itself was, famously, not good. The signature dish of the Spartan mess hall was something called black broth, melos zomos, a stew made of pork, blood, salt, and vinegar. Ancient writers from other Greek cities loved to mock it. One story, almost certainly exaggerated for comic effect, claims that a visitor from Sicily tasted Spartan black broth and remarked that now he understood why Spartans weren't afraid of death. Whether that anecdote is literally true almost doesn't matter. What it tells us is that Spartan cuisine was, quite deliberately, built for endurance rather than pleasure. Simplicity wasn't a side effect of poverty. It was policy. Clothing. Spartan clothing followed the same philosophy: practical, uniform, unshowy. Men typically wore a simple tunic and the famous red cloak, the phoinikis. Some ancient sources suggest red was chosen partly because it concealed bloodstains in battle, denying enemies the psychological satisfaction of watching a Spartan visibly bleed, though modern historians treat that explanation with some skepticism, since red dye was also simply practical and widely available. Either way, the cloak became a visual shorthand for Spartan identity itself. Religion. Religiously, Spartans worshipped the standard pantheon of Greek gods, but a few held special significance. Apollo was central to Spartan civic religion. His festival, the Hyacinthiae, was one of the most important events on the Spartan calendar. Artemis Orthia, a version of the goddess linked to wilderness, childbirth, and the transition into adulthood, had a sanctuary right in Sparta itself and, as we'll see in the next chapter, was closely tied to the brutal rites of passage young Spartan boys endured. The Spartans were also famously, almost obsessively, cautious about religious timing. They once delayed sending their army to help defend the pass at Thermopylae because a religious festival, the Carneia, hadn't yet concluded, a decision that arguably changed the course of that entire battle. Marriage and family. Spartan marriage customs were unlike anything else in the Greek world, and they read almost like folklore today, though multiple ancient sources describe them in similar terms. When a Spartan woman married, tradition held that her head was shaved. She was dressed in men's clothing and sandals and left alone in a darkened room. Her new husband, who, remember, was likely still living communally with his fellow soldiers rather than at home, would slip away from his barracks under cover of darkness to consummate the marriage, then return to his men before dawn. This arrangement could continue for years, with husbands sneaking home under darkness, sometimes not seeing their wives clearly in daylight until well into the marriage. Historians read this ritual a few different ways. Some see the bride's masculine dress and shaved head as a symbolic softening of the transition for young men who, thanks to the agoge, had spent most of their adolescence in close, male-only military company. Others see it as reflecting the genuinely secondary place that private domestic life held in a system almost entirely organized around communal military life. Either way, the point stands. In Sparta, even something as intimate as marriage was shaped by the demands of the state. Family life, correspondingly, looked very different from the rest of Greece. Producing children, specifically healthy future soldiers, was considered a civic duty, not simply a private matter. And as we'll explore fully in a later chapter, Spartan attitudes toward childbirth and child-rearing were shaped by one overriding priority: the health and strength of the next generation of warriors. What emerges from all of this, the plain houses, the communal meals, the practical clothing, the marriage customs oriented around military service, is a portrait of a society that had systematically stripped away almost everything that other Greek cities considered the good life: art, luxury, leisure, private comfort. In its place, Sparta offered something else entirely: order, discipline, and belonging to something larger than yourself. And nowhere was that trade-off more extreme or more consequential than in how Sparta raised its children. Which brings us to the most famous and most misunderstood institution in Spartan history, the agoge. Chapter 5. The agoge, Forging a Spartan. The Spartan system began before a child could even walk. According to Plutarch, writing centuries after the fact when a Spartan baby was born, It wasn't automatically the father's decision whether the child would live. The infant was brought before a council of elders from the child's tribe, who inspected it. If the baby appeared weak, sickly, or deformed, tradition holds it could be left exposed on the slopes of Mount Tegetos to die. We need to pause here, because this is one of the most debated claims in all of Spartan history. Plutarch wrote about this practice roughly 600 years after the events he was describing, relying on older sources that haven't survived. Modern archaeologists have actually excavated the supposed site on Taygetos and found no significant evidence of infant remains, which has led some historians to question whether this practice was as common, or even as real, as ancient writers claimed, versus being exaggerated or symbolic. What we can say with more confidence is that Spartan culture, from birth, placed the survival and strength of the community above the sentimental attachment other cultures placed on individual infants. Whether through formal inspection or simply a culture that idealized toughness from infancy, the message to every Spartan family was the same. Weakness was not something the state intended to invest in. Leaving home at 7. For boys who survived infancy, ordinary family life came to an abrupt end at around age 7. This is when a Spartan boy left his mother's household and entered the agoge, a state-run education and training system, and there's really no equivalent to it anywhere else in the ancient Greek world. From this point forward, the boy's education, discipline, meals, and daily life were the responsibility of the state, not his parents. Boys were organized into herds, or agalai, packed together with other boys their age, under the authority of an older Spartan youth chosen for leadership qualities. Within these groups, competition was constant and deliberately engineered. Boys were pitted against each other in wrestling, races, mock combat, and endurance tests, not to nurture individual talent, but to build the instincts of a soldier: toughness, obedience, and total loyalty to the group over the self. Discipline and deprivation. Life in the agoge was intentionally harsh. Boys went barefoot year-round to toughen their feet for marching over any terrain. They wore a single thin cloak, regardless of season, to build tolerance for cold. Their beds were made from reeds they had to gather themselves from the banks of the Eurotas River, pulled by hand without the use of a knife. A small but telling detail, since the difficulty of the task was the entire point. Food, too, was deliberately kept scarce. Boys were given only a limited ration and, remarkably, they were expected to supplement it by stealing food. But here's the twist that surprises most people. Getting caught stealing wasn't the problem. Getting caught was the crime. Stealing itself was treated almost as a skill to be honed. Cunning, stealth, and resourcefulness were qualities Sparta wanted its future soldiers to have. Plutarch tells one particularly famous, likely apocryphal story. A boy who had stolen a fox cub and hidden it under his cloak allegedly let the animal claw and bite into his stomach rather than cry out and reveal the theft, ultimately dying rather than showing weakness. Historians generally treat this story as later Spartan myth-making rather than literal fact, but it captures exactly the values the agoge was designed to instill: endurance over comfort, and silent stoicism over any outward display of pain. Education. It's a common myth that Spartans were illiterate brutes with no interest in learning. That's not accurate. Spartan boys did receive basic education in reading and writing. Sparta wasn't a society of illiterates, but intellectual education in Sparta looked very different from what you'd find in Athens. There was little interest in rhetoric for its own sake, philosophy, or artistic refinement. Instead, emphasis was placed on what the Greeks called laconic speech, short, blunt, memorable statements, a communication style so associated with Sparta's home region of Laconia that we still use the word laconic in English today to describe someone who speaks with brevity. Boys memorized poetry too, particularly the martial verses of the poet Tertius, which glorified courage in battle and warned against the shame of cowardice. Music and choral singing were part of the curriculum as well, tied closely to religious festivals and civic identity. So the picture that emerges isn't anti-intellectual exactly. It's an education stripped down to exactly what the state believed a soldier and citizen needed, and nothing more. The whip and the altar. Perhaps the most infamous ritual associated with the agoge is the diamastagosis. a ceremony held at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, in which adolescent boys were flogged, sometimes to the point of collapse or death in front of a watching crowd without crying out. In earlier centuries, this ritual is believed to have had a different, less extreme form. But by the Roman period, it had transformed into something closer to a spectacle. Roman writers describe crowds, even tourists, gathering to watch Spartan youths endure the whip as a demonstration of endurance, with an altar nearby said to require a blood offering. Historians debate how far back this extreme version really goes and how much was amplified for a Roman audience that found Spartan toughness exotic and entertaining. But even accounting for later exaggeration, the underlying principle was consistent across every era. Physical suffering, endured silently, was the ultimate proof of Spartan character. The Cryptia. At around age 18, a select group of the most promising young Spartans could be inducted into something called the Crypteia, often translated as the Secret Service. Officially, according to ancient sources like Plutarch, its purpose was to allow Sparta's most capable youths to live off the land alone, undetected, hunting and surviving by their own wits. But the Crypteia had a far darker function too. These young men were sent out to monitor, intimidate, and, according to multiple ancient sources including Plutarch, sometimes kill helots, particularly any who showed signs of independence, leadership, or the potential to organize resistance. Sparta lived in permanent structural fear of the population it enslaved, and the Crypteia was, in effect, a state-sanctioned death squad drawn from its own best young soldiers, meant to keep that population in check through terror.